Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Mark Plattner, the co-editor of the Journal of Democracy, and also co-editor with Larry Diamond and with Chris Walker, who's here with us on this panel, of Authoritarianism Goes Global, The Challenge to Democracy, a new Journal of Democracy book whose publication we're marking this afternoon. Published by Johns Hopkins University Press, the book is the outcome of a project that NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies launched in 2014 at a moment when we sense that the global context for democracy and democracy promotion was rapidly becoming more precarious than it had been in a very long time. At that same time, the Journal of Democracy was working on its 25th anniversary issue, which focused on the theme, Is Democracy in Decline? Democratic decline is, in a sense, the opposite side of the coin from the authoritarian resurgence, though it's not easy to spell out the causal relations between them, and that's something we may want to discuss later. In any case, all this represents an enormous shift from the days when the Journal of Democracy was first founded. Its first issue appeared in January of 1990. We'd opened our offices in September of '89, and in those couple of months, the Berlin Wall fell, the Velvet Revolution took place, and there were many amazing advances of democracy. And our first Journal of Democracy book, originally published in 1993, bore the title, The Global Resurgence of Democracy. I'd say from the point of view of our topic today, the period since the Cold War ended really can be divided into three fairly distinct phases. The first was a continuation and even acceleration of the democratic surge that had begun with the start of the third wave in the 1970s. It gradually slowed to a halt in the mid-2000s, and then in the immediate aftermath of the color revolutions in the former Soviet Union, there emerged what has been called the backlash, or sometimes the pushback, against democracy. Some authoritarian regimes that had succeeded in stabilizing themselves and managing to withstand the democratic resurgence began attempting to shore up their rule by imposing new restrictions on civil society and especially on external democracy assistance. But at that time, only a relatively limited number of countries were doing this, and their approach could be said to be largely defensive in intent and domestic in focus. But the third and newest post-Cold War trend has been an effort by the authoritarians not only to contain, but even to roll back democracy. They've done this both by developing more sophisticated techniques for stifling democratic opposition and independent civil society, and by increasingly cooperating with their fellow authoritarians. This cooperation takes the form first of copying or adapting one another's strategies and tools for domestic repression, what is sometimes dubbed autocratic learning or authoritarian learning. Thus, other authoritarian states have followed the lead of China with regard to devising methods to constrain freedom on the internet, while Russia has been the leader in passing laws to restrict foreign funding of civil society groups, but its laws have been imitated by many other countries. Authoritarian cooperation also takes the form of governments directly working with one another, especially within international and regional organizations, in trying to subvert or to replace democratic norms. They've done this both by weakening the democracy and human rights mechanisms of existing bodies like the OAS and the Council of Europe, but also by starting new clubs hostile to democracy, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's in this sense that authoritarianism has truly gone global. Very briefly, our book is divided into two sections. The first consists of chapters on what we've labeled the Big Five authoritarian powers, China, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. These regimes don't share common ideological or even necessarily geopolitical bonds, as is indicated by the inclusion of two countries that are bitter rivals, Iran and Saudi Arabia. Yet all five of these countries have been united by a desire to contain the global advance of democracy. And there are also countries that are big enough and rich enough to be able realistically to pursue influence on the global stage. The second section of the book has chapters on the key soft power arenas in which the authoritarian challenge has manifested itself. There has simultaneously and not coincidentally been a resurgence in authoritarian hard power as well, though this is largely beyond the focus of our book. The domains that the book covers include global and regional organizations, election monitoring, civil society, international media, and cyberspace. It had been widely thought that open societies would have a big advantage in these arenas, yet the authoritarians have proven surprisingly adept at competing there. They've put vastly more diplomatic energy and financial resources into these domains, as the competition in international media most clearly shows. The authoritarian advances in all these areas have proceeded incrementally. Often they've been little noticed in the democracies. And one goal of our book is to increase public awareness of this dimension of global political competition and to alert the democracies to the importance of taking it seriously. Our panel today is going to begin with remarks by Chris Walker, who's also a co-editor of the volume, and my successor as Ned's Vice President for Studies and Analysis. Chris will provide greater detail about what the authoritarians have been doing and the nature of the challenge that they pose. Then we will hear from two really outstanding commentators. Will Dobson, who's the chief international editor at NPR and the former Washington bureau chief for Slate, is also the author of the path-breaking 2012 book, The Dictator's Learning Curve, one of the first studies to emphasize the authoritarians' new repertoire of repression. And next to speak will be Fred Hyatt, the editorial page editor and columnist for the Washington Post. I think it's safe to say that no one else has played as crucial a role as Fred has done in keeping the struggle for democracy and human rights and the machinations of the authoritarians squarely in the public eye. Almost every day on the Post editorial op-ed page, one is reminded of this fact. Each of our panelists will speak for about 10 or 12 minutes, after which I may pose a few questions, but will then open the floor to questions and discussion from the audience. Those of you on Twitter can follow the presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag AutocratsGoGlobal or by following the forum at Think Democracy and the endowment at NE Democracy. I'd also urge you to visit the forum's website and its blog, Resurgent Dictatorship. That's at www.resurgentdictatorship.org. This blog is dedicated to the project we're presenting today, and to celebrate the launch of the book, the site over the coming weeks will feature guest blog posts written by several of the book's contributors, including Lilia Shetsova and Javier Corrales. Any of you who might wish to purchase copies of the books will find them available at the back of the room after the event at a discounted price of $20. We can take cash or check, but I'm afraid we're not equipped to handle credit cards. I also want to take the opportunity to thank the staff both of the Journal of Democracy and of the International Forum for Democratic Studies here at NED for their indispensable contributions to this project. And finally, I ask you all to join me in silencing your cell phones as we turn the floor over to our first speaker, Chris Walker.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. And I'd also at the outset like to thank the staff of the Journal of Democracy and the International Forum who put enormous work into this project, both in the meetings we convened and in getting the book into print. And I'd also like to thank Mark Plattner and Larry Diamond. It's been an absolute pleasure working with them on this book. These are two titans of democracy scholarship, and it's really been an honor to work with them on this effort. So what I'll do in the short time I have is to focus on the third part of the three periods on the timeline that Mark alluded to. This is the period that we might call the authoritarian surge. During this time, all of the countries that we examined in the book, and in fact other countries that I think are relevant to this discussion but weren't the focus of our discussion, they've all become more repressive. So if you go down the line, China, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, all of these countries, by most measures, are more repressive today than they were a decade ago. If you look at Freedom House data, this is the case. You can look at the way they treat their media, the way they treat political opposition, civil society. These were all systems that were rather repressive to start, and they've become even more so over this period of time. At the same time, over this 10-year period, these regimes that at the domestic level were becoming more repressive were also becoming more internationalist. And I'd like to stress this because I think part of what comes through in the book and part of what the contributing authors have zeroed in on is what the byproduct and the outgrowth of this combination of deepening repression domestically and growing internationalism has wrought. And so if you look at, just to take a few examples, the sphere of civil society. In all of the cases we've alluded to, the five that we've looked at, but this is true for other countries like Egypt, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, the techniques that are used to circumscribe the work and repress the work of civil society have become more sophisticated. These countries and the governments in them use the forms of law to restrict civil society action. They use very sophisticated techniques of media subversion to tarnish leading voices. If you look at the case of Boris Nemtsov, his family strongly believes, and I suspect they're right, that this toxic media environment created by the Russian state's dominance of the media space through its state media was a contributing factor to his assassination. And there is a long, long list of people in all of the countries we've mentioned who've been put to this sort of treatment where the media is used as an instrument for tarnishing, subverting, and delegitimizing them. But if we think about this idea of how this domestic innovation and refinement and incubation, I would say, of these ideas of repression and how they've kind of fine-tuned these efforts over the last decade, if you look at what these regimes are doing at the international level now, you'll see they're using adapted, not identical, but similar and adapted techniques in international rules-making bodies, in the media sphere, where international media at the hands of these authoritarian regimes make the arguments against the legitimacy of civil society using a variety of these sorts of arguments. If you look at specific rules-based bodies where the rule of law and democracy and human rights should be upheld, talk about this at the regional level, places like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Council of Europe, the Organization of American States, certainly in key United Nations bodies that are relevant to democracy and human rights. These have all been a focal point of the regimes we're discussing. And so they've, not with entire success in all of these settings, but with, I would argue, the same sort of logic that they're applying at home to manipulate and control and pursue regime interests. And this, I think, is critical to understanding what drives these sorts of actions. It's, I believe, based on regime security, and you can kind of extract and extrapolate from that what drives this kind of behavior. But I think this is really the biggest shift we've seen over the past decade or so, where many of the approaches, the techniques, are being elevated from the domestic level to the international level, including the regional level. So just a couple of other examples to put this in perspective. I mentioned the OSCE, I mentioned the Council of Europe and the OAS. The internet has become a far more challenging or threatening instrument to all of these regimes. And so it's not surprising that they've marshaled enormous resources and enormous thinking to create norms and practical ways of restricting internet freedom, and most importantly, open political speech within their borders. So this has given birth to arguments of internet sovereignty, which China pushes extremely hard through their own state media domestically and internationally. Their diplomats push this concept extremely diligently in the relevant international bodies that shape internet norms. Russia likewise takes a similar perspective. And as Mark alluded to in his introductory remarks, if you look at countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, which don't agree on much of anything, when it comes to the concepts of internet sovereignty and how the UN bodies that oversee this and the ITU and others will treat it, they're very much in alignment. And it tells you something. And so the efforts domestically, I would argue, are critically important to understanding what we're seeing and the evolution on the international, i.e. the going global side of things. If you look at media more broadly, you'll see that in all of these cases, but we can use Russia as the example here, one of the paramount goals of the authorities in Russia has been to not simply create media that can control, but media that also has a degree of attractiveness. See the same sort of thing in China, where the authorities have allowed an enormous amount of at least nominally private media, but the inducements that are offered to journalists and editors who work within China are such that they have to produce content that's politically anodyne, but commercially interesting and attractive, so that they can attract audiences. I think this point is often overlooked by observers, that this simply isn't the gray, old propaganda of the old days. There's a lot of entertainment that's been integrated, often very high production value. It's true in Russia and it's true in China. But at the heart of this is maintaining effective control over political speech, over meaningful civic discussion, certainly over corruption. That's one of the red lines in all of these countries without exception. And you can see this now in the treatment of the Panama Papers, where the directives coming out of the CCP editorial organs are very clear. Don't report on this. If it shows up online, cleanse the online space of it. Likewise in Russia, you're not going to see any meaningful report, certainly not on Russian state television, that has anything to do with this corruption. And so, by way of conclusion, I'll use corruption as one other example. If you think about the way in which these regimes, certainly the 5 we've examined in the book, but not limited to them, have adapted in the era of globalization, and in essence, repurposed globalization to their ends, which, if you think about their standards, these are standards not of free expression, but of restricted expression, not of open debate, but of manipulated debate, not of pluralism politically, but of control politically. They've used this as a way to circumscribe discussion beyond their borders increasingly. And if we look at the corruption dimension of this, here too they've managed to integrate corruption into their international behavior. So Russia uses hydrocarbons as one of its principal instruments of control around and beyond its borders. But as we see increasingly through a considerable amount of new work being done by institutions like the Kleptocracy Initiative, there's much more of a nexus between this internationalized environment and the corruption of not only the countries we're discussing, but of the democracies. And I think if the democracies are to make some sort of headway against this, they're going to have to realize that the ambitions of these regimes are very much aligned with their own preferences, meaning the preferences of regimes that are not interested in free expression, not interested in keeping any sort of meaningful check on venality and corruption, but instead on enabling those things, not only domestically today, but beyond their borders. So I'll leave it with that.
Thank you, Chris. And now next we'll hear from Will Dobson.
Well, thank you very much. So I was asked to focus my comments on how I think the world has changed since my book came out, The Dictator's Learning Curve, which was in 2012. My book was primarily looking at the struggle between authoritarian regimes and the people and movements who challenge them. And it was based on reporting that I did in a number of different countries between roughly 2009 and 2012. So that's really the benchmark that I'm using here in thinking about how we've seen the situation and the conditions and circumstances around the world evolve since that time. And part of the book argued, the essential argument was that modern authoritarians are more sophisticated, savvy, and nimble than we often appreciate. That having faced a barrage of growing pressures, many of the pressures that Mark mentioned at the outset, the smartest among them didn't harden their regimes into police states, and they didn't cut themselves off from the world. Rather, they learned and they adapted. In effect, they were honing new techniques, methods, formulas for preserving power, in essence, refashioning dictatorship for a modern age. Now, I think that remains true, and this excellent new collection looks at many of those tools, and for people in this audience, they're tools that many of us are familiar with: gongos, fake election monitors, internet censorship, and so on. But it's also true that the world isn't a static place, and there have been clear changes and developments and trends, shifts in the intervening, let's say, 4 years. So that even while many of these regimes continue to draw from the same toolkit that they developed over the previous decade, there have been changes, and I just like to highlight three. There are many more, but I think three, to me, seem to be maybe most telling. The first will come as no surprise, which is the global crackdown on civil society. Since 2012, more than 120 laws targeting NGOs have been proposed or enacted in more than 60 countries. Now, if you think about that for a second, it's sort of an incredible thing. I mean, that's an enormous number, and we can look at sort of the focus of those laws, but in some of the most pernicious and effective have been those that have been looking to target the connection between domestic NGOs overseas and international funding, in large part trying to pull up the drawbridge, if you will, that connects democracies and dictatorships in an effort to isolate, marginalize, and in some cases eliminate those NGOs, which are in many places, as you know, one of the only forces for pluralism that one can find. But if you think back to 120 laws, 60 countries, I mean, it's rare to find that much commonality in the international system on anything. When do we see that sort of concert of action? And in such a short period of time, I mean, you have to sort of look at that and recognize that essentially amounts to an authoritarian norm. And it's emerged. It's something that's been building for a long period of time, but it has really picked up pace in that period of time. And this was even, this is obvious even in the report released by the State Department yesterday, and its Human Rights Report. It's almost easier to try and find places where this isn't true than where it is. So it's truly a global phenomenon, which has picked up pace. The second, and I think this is one that people are only beginning to fully recognize, and I don't think it's gotten the attention that it really even deserves, is the change afoot in China. China has changed a tremendous amount in this period of time. Now, we see that often in terms of the outward manifestations of that. So we're thinking of the South China Sea, and we're looking at the development of something like the AIIB or other areas of Chinese foreign policy. You could see it just this week in sort of this much more bold and unflinching attitude or posture in the deportation of Taiwanese citizens from Kenya to China to be tried for crimes that they may have committed in Kenya. There were lots of ways for that to happen. China could have pressed its case as being a national security matter, but rather than do that, they've expressed their argument as being part and parcel of the One China policy. So it's a much more muscle-flexing sort of approach, and a message clearly intended to be sent to Taiwan and to other African nations as well. So we see it in these ways, this sort of much bolder China, but I actually believe that the changes going on within China are even more consequential. Under Xi Jinping, what we appear to be witnessing, and a really incredible moment that I think that will really register in sort of the arc of modern Chinese history, is the fundamental reorientation ideologically and organizationally of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, this is, for me, in a political, looking at it from a political sense, almost similar, potentially similar to going back to 1978, 1979 in terms of a hard shift occurring within the Chinese political system. Typically, when we look at the Chinese Communist Party, we see a pendulum swing, and then you can look at this over many decades between periods of relaxing and tightening. Since 2008, we've just gone from tightening to greater tightening. Really, since the infrastructure that was put in place by security bureaus ahead of the 2008 Olympics, the new normal has only become one that's more restrictive. But that has taken on a completely different complexion with the change in leadership. It would appear that Xi Jinping is almost recrafting the leadership model that has governed in post-Deng Xiaoping China, which, as opposed to leadership through consensus at the top, he has, in short order, placed himself at the core, and that's the term that's actually used, the core of decision-making across the party and government. And his corruption campaign, it's a brilliant in that both it works effectively to marginalize political competitors and competitive factions, but it is also something that is understood as being necessary for the resilience of the system itself, and is also popular. I was in China not long ago, and spending time talking to, I would say upper middle class Chinese gentlemen who said to me, I have no illusions about what this campaign is really about, but I have to tell you that there was a tax, a fee really, that I always had to pay for the school that my children go to. And we all know that this was really just a payment. There was no real function attached to this fee. But the reach of Xi Jinping is so great that that fee was eliminated last year. And so it really touches people in their daily life, and in that way is received welcomely by many people. But the changes, I mean, what we see moving is having a real chilling effect, not just in media, in civil society, but within the party itself. I don't think anyone's written better about this topic than David Shambaugh, but I think it's a crucial thing that is occurring in real time before us right now, and I don't think could have been appreciated or fully anticipated in 2012. And then maybe the last one I would just highlight, which is abroad, is that I think that in large measure, authoritarians are dropping the pretense. And by that I mean that the methods that are being used, while I maintain you can find great degree of sophistication, they are also more and more coercive. And I think that maybe there's no better example of this than Russia. Early in the Putin era, Putin went to much greater lengths to maintain the democratic trappings of his political moves. That has become less and less true as power has been centralized in a much greater way, and that restrictions and really ultimately violations of constitutional and personal freedoms have become more widespread. Institutions like the public chamber, which were created in order, in part, to sort of help manage the risk of having a rubber stamp parliament that effectively wasn't giving you good information on whether ideas were popular or not, was an infrastructure that was created by a regime that cared about managing that risk. That has become less and less true, and the evidence for it is Crimea and Ukraine and Syria, where increasingly provocative action is required to arguably help maintain legitimacy at home. And so there's a way in which, I mean, I think in the case of Russia, the power vertical, the so-called power vertical has come back with a vengeance. But one wouldn't have to limit oneself just to Russia. I think this is true in many other places. Now, why is this happening? I think there can be many reasons. I'll suggest just one, which is that it's hard to maintain a democratic veneer for long. Age wears at us, and it wears at authoritarian regimes too. And the facades are generally the first thing to go. So I think it's actually quite natural in some respects for there to be a turn inward and for there to be a resort to coercive measures, because that was always really the root of the regime's power in the first place. And for me, that's certainly borne out by the experience I had meeting and interviewing the people that I did over the course of those several years for my book. In every country that I reported from, activists that I interviewed have been jailed, exiled, or murdered. Leopoldo Lopez in Venezuela, Ahmed Mer in Egypt, Anwar Ibrahim in Malaysia, Puja Chang in China, and of course Boris Nemtsov in Russia. So it leaves me with the question, so are these the actions of confident regimes? I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Will, for an extremely interesting set of remarks. And now we'll turn to Fred Hyatt.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to the National Endowment for allowing me to associate myself with this superb book, for which I can claim no credit. I was asked to talk a little bit about the Western response to this surge in authoritarianism, where it's been lacking and how it could improve. Being a journalist, I'm happier doing the former than the latter, criticizing and carping rather than being positive, but I'll try to do a little bit of both. I'd start, though, with one big question, not a polite one in this crowd or at this institution, but I think one that we can't ignore, which is that before we think about our response to this surge of authoritarianism, we have to ask whether the world's democracies can continue to demonstrate that our system is superior and sustainable. This has always been a vital question, and one that has to be continually re-answered and reproven. But I would say in the past year, it's become somewhat less theoretical. For the better part of a century, democracies have shown that liberty, private property, free markets, and human rights provide the best route to happiness and prosperity. But we face new stresses, as everybody here knows: aging populations, slowing economies, the pressures of globalization, and the fracturing enabled by new technologies. All have put new stresses on our political systems. And in the past year, developments from Hungary to Poland to France to the United States have reminded us of what our founding fathers understood in their gut, that constitutional norms are fragile and that the temptation of demagoguery is never all that distant. Obviously, if we fail to resist that temptation, the rest of this conversation is irrelevant. We will not provide the example or the leadership to resist the authoritarian surge. But let's assume, more happily, as I do, that our systems will again rise to the challenge. How then can we respond, and why have we not responded more vigorously so far? One way to look at this would be to look at the three American presidents who've been in office over the period that Mark described. You had Bill Clinton, whose failure was mostly one of imagination. Like most of us, I think he couldn't and didn't imagine that the tide of democratization could reverse so dramatically, that men like Nazarbayev and Mugabe would rally and become actors in this drama rather than simply waiting for history to act on them. And that the internet, like every technology, I think, could become a force for repression as well as for freedom. Then you had George W. Bush, who had really little interest in promoting freedom until the failure to find WMD in Iraq forced him to embrace a new rationale for the war, and who then embraced that rationale with the zeal of a true convert, for better and for worse. And then you have Barack Obama, whose record in many ways is the most surprising. But I'm not going to approach it through that lens. Instead, I want to suggest 6 traps that I think, no matter who's president, we tend to fall into, that often keep us from leading the fight for liberty, and that we'll have to avoid if we're going to meet the challenge described in this book. So the first is the trap of inevitability. The biggest advantage we have in this fight is that we are right, fundamentally. People do want to live in freedom and with dignity, and this is true whether they are Chinese or Arab or Finn or Brazilian or anybody else. But it's very easy to allow that truth to become an article of faith, which then becomes an article of fatalism. History is on our side. Putin and Xi Jinping are bound to fail. The occupation of Crimea and Donbass in the long run will prove a strategic error. Therefore, why bother to give defensive weapons to Ukraine? During the Cold War, we believed, rightly, that history was not on the side of communism, but we didn't sit back and wait for it to fail. We understood that the longer it lasted, the more lives would be ruined. And we understood that the long run could last a very long time. And we believed we had a responsibility to do what we could within the bounds of prudence, which admittedly we did not always measure correctly, to hasten freedom's advance. So that's one. The second trap, I would say, is the trap of higher priority. It was striking to me to hear President Obama go to Buenos Aires and apologize to the people of Argentina for America's having put security over human rights a generation ago, at the very moment that his administration was pursuing an almost identical policy with a regime that today is engaging in similar but worse abuses, including torture, mass imprisonment, and disappearances. That is Egypt. It was striking that the United States is making the same compromises for similar reasons, that we need Egypt's help in the security realm, and that we're making similar calculations in Uganda and Ethiopia, in Malaysia, in Thailand, and other places you all are familiar with, putting security or development or other goals ahead of liberty. Now, I get a great power cannot have a single-purposed foreign policy. But the trap of higher priority often conceals 2 fundamental errors. First, I think in general other leaders will cooperate on matters of security or development or other issues if they think it's in their interest to do so. And they will not cooperate if they don't think it's in their interest. And whether we are nice to them or mean to them about human rights will figure very little in their calculation. Second, and more important, often the best way to promote security in many cases is to promote liberty. And one of the biggest dangers to liberty is the increasing repression in these countries. Increasing danger to security. We all understand that fact in the abstract, but it seems that our leaders, when they get in power, often quail at putting it into practice. Third and related is the helping the moderates trap. We often believe we've discovered a reasonable faction inside an unreasonable regime. And in order not to cause them difficulty, we avoid any rude discussions of torture or censorship, let alone any response to such abuses. Again, I see 2 flaws in this. We often tend to imagine moderates where the evidence for moderation is very slight. And again, more to the point, to the extent moderates do exist, we are more likely to undercut them than help them with our appeasement. The best way to bolster reformists, in other words, would be to enable them to argue internally that there is some cost to bad behavior. Fourth is the mirror image trap. We assume, because it's true for us, that more discussions, more speech, more reporters, more think tanks, more university campuses, that all of this is a good thing, that it promotes thought and debate and reasoned compromise. And this has left us very poorly prepared to deal with reporters who are really Secret Service agents, think tanks that are really propaganda mills, and the like. More fundamentally, we often assume, looking in the mirror, that because our leaders act, however imperfectly, in what they see as their country's interest, that dictators will do the same. Why would Putin invade Crimea when doing so will so clearly hurt Russia? Why would China endanger its prosperity by picking a fight with Japan? It makes no sense. But these are leaders who often behave more like mafia dons than what we think of as national leaders. Their primary goal is to preserve their wealth and power. Nationalism can be useful to distract from their illegitimacy, and public opinion cannot be ignored, but national interest is not their primary consideration. Fifth, and related to this, is the trap of conflating the regime with the country. The Chinese embassy here once had a very nice press counselor who would call me whenever we published a critical editorial, and he would say, "The Chinese people are very disappointed." And I would say, "How do you know?" Eventually, we both sort of figured out how this dialogue would unfold, and we kind of substituted a few sighs for the script and then would move on to other topics. But the first time I asked him, "How do you know?" he was flabbergasted. And he said, "What do you mean, how do I know?" And I said, "Well, you don't let people vote, and if people dare criticize your government, they risk imprisonment. So how would you know whether they're disappointed or not disappointed?" The White House went out of its way before President Obama's trip to Havana to make clear that it was not looking for regime change, as if doing so would hurt the feelings of the Cuban people. But the Castros are not the Cuban people, and the Cuban people are not the Castros. The U.S. policy should not be to impose regime change, but neither should it be to favor regime stability. We should favor allowing the Cuban people to determine their own future. Finally, and maybe most difficult, is the lesser evil trap. This is the calculation we make that however odious a regime may be, the alternative would be worse. And of course, these regimes do everything they can to make that true. If I could offer one suggestion for your second edition, it would be to pay more attention to this very much shared characteristic among all of these regimes, that they destroy first and most viciously their most plausible, reasonable opposition. The Egyptians go after the liberal bloggers from Tahrir Square even before the Muslim Brotherhood. Putin locks up Navalny and the anti-corruption crusaders, not his most odious nationalists. The Chinese regime targets most relentlessly the liberal, moderate lawyers who want peacefully to work within China's constitution to bring about gradual change. And once those people are out of the way, they can come and say, we're all that stand between China and civil disorder. So what to do about this? Well, I would like to tell you, but I think my time is up. Maybe we can come back to it in discussion. For now, I would just say, I think we could go a long way if we simply decided that even if history is on our side, we are both entitled and called upon to give history a nudge, that doing so should be a priority of our national policy, and that we should prepare ourselves in advance so that the next time we have an unexpected opportunity, like the Arab Spring, we will be better prepared to seize it. Thank you.
Thank you for an exceedingly eloquent as well as cogent set of remarks. Let me just pose a question or two before we open it up to the audience. And let me start with Will's question as to why this has changed over the last 4 or 5 years. I think there's something to what you suggested about these regimes returning to their inner nature in some way, dropping the facade. But the reason they had the facade in the first place, I think it's fair to say, was that they thought there was a price to be paid for not having them, for not looking more democratic and so on. And it seems to me that is perhaps what has most changed in the last few years. That both that democracy's appeal is not as powerful as it was, perhaps because of the reasons that Fred indicated, but also that the sense that there's a great deal to lose if you're not welcomed by the international community, the West and so on, that concern is largely dissipated. I guess you can say that democracies these days are perhaps neither loved nor feared. But I wonder if, let me start with Will, how you would react to that and whether this is at the heart of the problem in some way.
No, I think that's a very good point. I think it is true that the Democratic brand, if you will, has been damaged to some degree and doesn't have maybe the attractive appeal as it did. On the other hand, I think that you could have said the same thing about that moment, the moments right before the Arab Spring. I mean, in many ways, the world was in the sort of throes of a global economic recession. We shouldn't forget the economic turmoil of that moment. At that moment in time, I don't think the Democratic brand was particularly strong either. This has been a problem of some long standing, but to Fred's point, it is true that people, even in those conditions, even at a moment such as that, they still aspire to be free. And so I think that it's a two-way street. On the one hand, yes, it's the case that there have been plenty of stretches of time where the strength of protest movements and demands for change and anger has been even greater in some of our longstanding democracies. I'm thinking of the protests in Brazil not very long ago. But at the same time, we can't sort of sell these regimes short for the efforts that they put in as well to burnish their credentials and take advantage of this moment. So I think both are true, but it's I think that it becomes much more difficult over time to repeat the same arguments that you've used before and that was so acute to me, at least, with the protests that began in late 2011 in Russia, where it appeared, I think, for a moment that they dropped their guard and almost sort of rubbed people's face in it, that the whole Medvedev experiment had really just been a ruse, and surely you understood that. Surely you were in on the joke. Oh, you weren't in on the joke? At the same moment that parliamentary elections, that even by Russian standards were incredibly corrupt, it created a boiling point. I don't think it's ever been the same since. And I think we could find a similar phenomenon in other places as well.
I agree with that. I just add a couple of things about, why is it happening? I mean, part of it is they learn from each other and it succeeds and there's not enough of a price to be paid and so forth. But I think you also, to some extent, can look at it as a reflection of the failure of the authoritarian ideologies. Putin was able to govern for his first 8 years more or less with the consent of the people, and the idea was, I leave you alone, you leave me alone, my people can get rich, you can travel. And 2011, as Will said, showed that a lot of people, at least in the cities, weren't buying this anymore. And so he had to kind of come up with a whole new ideology, as well as a much more repressive method of imposing it. And, the same is true in China. I mean, remarkably, people continue to show that they're not entirely happy with this. And you keep seeing folks in the press and bloggers popping up and saying, no, we want to say, and we're not entirely convinced that this fight against corruption is purely a fight against corruption. And and the third piece of that is that, when I said these people are like mafia dons, one corollary of that is you can't retire. So, okay, there are a few African dictators who've got nice houses on the beach in Saudi Arabia, but for the most part, the deeper in you go, the more dangerous it is to step down. And, I think it'll be an interesting question. I mean, it's been an amazing thing in China that every 10 years in a one-party state, you've had a rotation of leadership. After the kind of purge that we're seeing now, will that still be possible? I don't know. But given that it's dangerous to retire, in a way, they're doubling down because they have no choice.
Let me just make one thing clear. I mean, I certainly didn't mean to suggest that the enthusiasm of civil society groups for democracy had diminished. I mean, at NED every day we see evidence to the contrary, and the public opinion data continues to show global support for democracy. What seems to really change is that the oppressors no longer feel the same fear of
Right.
openly repressing as they once did. Kristen?
One further observation, I think what comes through in certainly the country chapters in the book is that all of the countries under discussion are incredibly fragile. They have extraordinary flaws, and yet their regimes are emboldened in many ways. And so it's a strange combination, perhaps not so incongruent when you think of all the efforts they're taking to retain power, as Fred noted. In one way to look at Russia, certainly, despite the public opinion polls that come out from time to time showing very high approval ratings of one sort or another for Vladimir Putin, is that the machinery, the state apparatus that has to be devoted and the resources that have to be devoted to keep that sort of level up there through media censorship, through propaganda, through intimidation, coercion, through letting tens of thousands of capable Russians leave the country because they're free to do so, and they do so in very large numbers. You see variants of this in all the cases we're looking at, and I think this is one of the dimensions. And I think the other thing that shines through, certainly in the thematic analysis in the book, is that precisely because these regimes don't have a compelling ideology or governance argument, they've really set their sights on attacking the democracies and their prestige. So they do it in different ways. If you watch any of Russia's state media, whether it's domestic or international, they devote a lot of very intense focus on this sort of thing. But in other ways, you see this from these other illiberal states where the idea is to undermine, raise questions, confuse, and they do it not only through the media, but through surrogates that act as think tanks and gongos, and it's very unitary and systematic. So that's really been the substitute for any sort of affirmative idea to govern or to suggest their countries could be models.
Thank you. Okay, let's open it up to the audience, and Carl, as usual, is first off the mark. Carl Gershwin, president of NED.
First of all, my thanks to all of you. This is really, really good, and I really enjoyed it. Look, Fred, when you talked about the three presidents, you didn't really talk about the last one. You just said it was surprising.
I noticed.
And now the last one has, stated his views in the Atlantic about Syria and how proud he was of that, and also about Putin's sphere of influence and so on and so forth. Might you comment on that, all of that? Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. So, I think in some ways, the foreign policy that Obama came into office with might have been appropriate or was appropriate for the world that you described at the end of phase two. You know, he was committed to meeting with autocratic regimes, and he thought he could do a better job of diplomacy on that than the previous administration had done, and that it was foolish not to talk to them. You know, in a world where they're receding and you're just kind of trying to manage their decline, that's not an unreasonable position to take. In a world where they're gaining strength, then you have to go back and look at, okay, 2009 in Iran, was it the right policy for us to more or less ignore the Green Movement and say we only want to engage with the regime? I think it looks very different. And I also think that, you know, every president, to some extent, their ideology evolves in response to events while they're president. And so I mentioned that, you know, Bush, his second inaugural was very different from the way he had talked when he was running for president for his first term. For Obama, because he, you know, he was committed not only to dealing with these regimes, but also to the pivot to Asia. And so when the Arab Spring happened, in my view, his administration saw it more as a distraction than as an opportunity. And then it went bad, and Syria in particular went bad. And on his watch, you now have this incredible humanitarian disaster. And so I think it's natural that somebody then has to fashion a rationale for why things turned out the way they did. And unfortunately, the rationale that we see him coming up with is this region is hopeless, ancient tribal hatreds. It's going to be a generation before these people could possibly have democracy. You know, you all know better than I do that these are the same arguments we heard about the Balkans. I remember reading that they're similar to arguments that were made about Koreans, you know, and other people in East Asia, that the Confucian culture and the rice-growing culture was not compatible with democracy. And I tend to look at them more as excuses than as explanations. Maybe I'll stop there.
Okay. We have a mic coming to you.
Thank you. I'm Maryam Imar-Sadeghi from Tavana. It's an e-learning institute for Iranian civil society. And I wanted to just add a few thoughts, and maybe these are probably in the book. From an Iran perspective, I think one thing that is different from the past, even the near past, is that these repressive regimes are less obviously oppressive, and their propaganda works more. Even members of the opposition, people who consider themselves part of the democratic opposition, are repeating the rhetoric of these regimes without knowing it. And that free markets or freer markets coexist with closing of political space. And it seems like that's a basic thesis from the past that, at least for the moment, is being proven wrong. And so one question I think, in addition to that, is how much do you all think that this big trend, global trend, is undermining democracy, even in established democracies? And I'm thinking of especially Europe. Thank you.
Chris?
Well, I think it's an important question. If there's one big surprise, and it's not simply something that Lilia Shevtsova has written about in the Russia chapter of the book, I think if you spoke to people 7 or 8 years ago and said, not only will Russia have militarily intervened in Ukraine and annexed Crimea, but have very active media initiatives operating in Central Europe, enormous interests in Southeastern Europe of various sorts, not simply commercial, but diplomatic and political. Most people would say, oh, it sounds a bit exaggerated or hard to see that. But of course, that's what's happened. And in the meantime, not solely because of Russia, but because of pressures within these countries or the way their politics have evolved, countries like Hungary, Poland, and others, the condition of these democracies is far less stable and far more in question today than I think most observers could have imagined a decade ago. So when you look at this decade period during which we've focused on the authoritarian deepening, clearly there are reverberations, and I think that's one of the things that comes out of the book. If Fred alluded to China's, or perhaps it was Will who alluded to China's treatment of the Taiwanese in Kenya. If you look at the Chinese treatment of the booksellers beyond their borders who are being abducted and brought back to China, these are all things that are happening very systematically. Mark mentioned incrementally, but I think if you step back and look at them in toto, you see the norms are being challenged, and it's not just within the club of authoritarian states. Clearly, this has an impact on the democratic space in so many ways.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I would just add, I think that, and echoing what I said at the outset, I think it is true that the regimes are still sophisticated and savvy in many ways. I don't know that I agree that they aren't more obviously coercive. I do think that we've seen a greater penchant for acting coercively internally, and that within many of these countries, it is commonly understood that the situation has become much more cynical, much more violent, ultimately. That the bonds of trying to govern through some sort of consensus have been broken, and the regime has been forced to fall back on other measures that it might not have wanted to initially because it's expensive and costly to be coercive, but ultimately is willing to. Obviously, we have to look at a case-by-case basis. The situation in Venezuela is one in which, as a government is almost in free fall, it's not shocking to see that it turned to more and more coercive and restrictive measures when a government is replaced, in essence. Although the military was always, the most competent and biggest player in Mubarak's Egypt, there is a difference between having a Mubarak and having a Sisi in place, and there is a difference in having a pure and obvious military dictatorship in place, and any human rights activist in Egypt will tell you that. But I think that, to me, what's interesting, and the book does a very good job of tackling this question, is I think while it's become more coercive internally, that does not limit a regime's ability to become more sophisticated outwardly. And we see that in the production of narratives, very well produced, that are broadcast outside, and that's something that wouldn't have been true before, or was very incipient at least. And so there's almost been a divorce between the techniques that are used internally versus those that are used for external consumption, and that in itself is a sure sign of sophistication.
I just wanted to add, because I thought you make a very good point about these regimes trying to show that freer markets can coexist with closing political space. And that certainly remains true. Russia and China today, people have much more personal freedom and much more economic freedom than they did in the Cultural Revolution or in Stalin's day, obviously. But I would say none of them have been able to demonstrate that they can deliver prosperity with closing political space. 4 of the 5 are oil powers that really never have not been able to move beyond their resource dependency. And China, one of the most fascinating things about this moment is that I think the Chinese leaders understand, nobody has gone beyond 10,000 per capita without increasing political freedom, except maybe Singapore, and there are asterisks there. China understands the things they need to do to grow economically are things like rule of law and less corruption and open debate and more entrepreneurship and more creativity and in their universities. But those are all things that threaten one-party rule. And so they're in this dilemma where they know what the economic reforms they need. They can't bring themselves to do it because of the political risk. And So I would say what you say as a statement is something that remains to be tested. Can they really maintain free markets while closing the political space? Very unclear.
John Sullivan?
I just wanted to offer perhaps a nuance on the idea that these are freer markets. And that I would recommend a couple of things. One, a conversation with Andrew Nathan, who's written some really good stuff, I think, for the Journal of Democracy, particularly on this subject. And, he took on the issue of, I think in the Lipset lecture, he took on this question of the rising middle class in China to point out that as Valley Nasser has shown in the Middle East, this is a dependent middle class. This is not a rising middle class of merchants and professors and writers and independent people. It is a rising middle class of people who are dependent on the state. And similarly, I would recommend looking at Bob Lighton and Robert Baumol's book, Good Capitalism, Bad Capitalism, because the idea that these are free markets is, I think, only to the outside observer who's looking from quite a distance. When you actually go and look at Russia, I would not say, and most Russians wouldn't say, I've talked to a lot of Russians who say, if I'm going to copyright or try to get an intellectual property on an invention I've got, I'm certainly not going to file it in Moscow. I'm going to file it in San Francisco because there I can get it protected. You got to look at property rights, rule of law, the other institutions of a market economy. And when you do, you see that these, in fact, aren't free markets. They're authoritarian markets. And that's a subject, I think, that would be worthy of deeper digging by the journal.
Thanks, John. Andrea?
Thank you very much. My name is Mohammed Al Abdullah. I'm from the Syria Justice and Accountability Center. Thank you, Fred, very much for what you just said about Syria and for all of your articles about Syria. In fact, pointing the consequences of President Obama's policy in Syria. I have a question, takes you back to 2005 to Condoleezza Rice's remarks in the American University of Cairo, when she admitted that backing dictators for 50 or 60 years didn't grant us neither stability nor security, so we sacrificed one for another and then we get nothing. But then you get the democracy promotion who ended up quickly after Hamas winning the election in Gaza and the Muslim Brotherhood's winning 100 seats in the parliament in 2006 in Egypt. Do you think the US has ever actually been promoting democracy in the Middle East? We just went back to the old course of things. And today, if you look at Ted Cruz's statements about Muammar al-Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein will be safer countries for us, and if you look at even Bernie Sanders saying, while we promote democracy, but dictators in the Middle East is more safer to the United States. I want two answers, two questions. One, has the United States truly promoted democracy and supported human rights movements in the Middle East? Second, what's the role of war and terror playing to make this conversation worse? Thank you.
Who would like to take it?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I should have said in response to Carl that this administration, it's not all one way or the other. I mean, I think, if you look at Burma, for example, they have played a role in pushing toward democratization, and that's been true in other places too. In the Middle East, as you say, not long after Secretary Rice gave that speech, you could see the Bush people already pulling back, and by the end, they were not pushing Mubarak in any way. I think, basically, in that region, there's always been some priority that has taken precedence over democracy. I think the Bush administration did come to this moment of understanding that the things we were afraid of had been spawned by these terrible, corrupt, closed, dictatorial regimes where, scientific literature was never translated into Arabic, and there was so little exchange of young people, and so many young people were unemployed. But they never had the courage to act on that conviction and to break old habits. When the Arab Spring was getting going, Steve Hadley, actually then out of power, wrote an op-ed for us in which he said, and I'm paraphrasing, this won't be right, but more or less, we should seize on this the way that Europe and North America did when Eastern and Central Europe began to free themselves in 89 to 91. And, with all the resources that we have, trade and exchanges and encouragement of all kinds, recognizing that this is a generational opportunity. Europe was very distracted by its own problems with the euro, and with the United States was more interested in Asia, and the administration sort of saw this as just kind of another way to get sucked back into a region that Bush had mired us in, and the future was elsewhere. And so we didn't seize that opportunity. Now, obviously, none of us can say, well, if we had, would things have turned out differently in Egypt and Tunisia and Syria and elsewhere, Iraq. You don't know for sure, but there was certainly a good enough chance that it would have been worth the resources, the rather modest resources it would have taken. I think instead we kind of reverted to our traditional posture.
Chris?
And on the second part of your question, it's clearly had an impact. So the article that Doug Grutzen has written on civil society in the book uses the security and terrorism challenge as one of the clear explanations for the downward turn that Will alluded to at the outset, where you have a raft of laws. A subset of those have been grounded on arguments connected to terrorism and security. I think the challenge for so many of the governments that are appropriating these terms is where checks and balances come in, certainly on the domestic level, but this is part of their international argument as to why a more absolutist version or vision of sovereignty should get priority. This is part of that. And some of the other arguments they make along these lines to defend their vision of how civil society and essentially political opposition should be treated.
Can't see them all. There's three right over here. And I'll go to the back next.
Alex Sokolowski, USAID. Thank you to all the panelists for very interesting, insightful comments, and thank you to Ned for putting together this discussion and the book project. I wanted to return to the tough question of what do we do about all of this. I think that Fred Hyatt has talked about saying, okay, besides setting a good example for things we can do, he's told us what not to do. I would actually add to that one other trap, which is probably the rhetorical trap that I think Tom Carruthers has talked about with regard to the Bush administration. You talk a lot about what you want to do, but you don't do as much. But I wonder what kind of new agenda on democracy promotion would look like, even if it's just sketching out a few elements, because that is really kind of the key question. Thanks.
Why don't we take a couple of more now?
Kathy Cosman, U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I have a pretty short question, which is, to what degree do you think officially controlled or state-controlled majority religions play in the ideologies of the countries you're discussing? It's pretty clear in the case of Russia, but I think it also plays a role in some of the other states. Thank you.
And there was one more next time.
Hello, my name is Alicia Thompson. My question is essentially my question is based on, lately we've seen at least two different examples of people who were once connected with authoritarian regimes by either being the autocratic ruler or being descended from the autocratic ruler come to power. The two examples that come to mind, sorry, nervous, are South Korea with President Gun-hae Park, and then also the current president, Muhammadu Buhari of Nigeria. So what are your opinions on the fact that these two people, one a former autocratic ruler, and then the other one the daughter of a former autocratic ruler of a country, what does that say about today's society? Do you think they're trying to make changes, or do you think they are going to revert back?
Okay, who wants to take any of those? Maybe I'll say a word about that last question, and more of a political scientist question in a way. In a way, it's disappointing when a country that's become democratic winds up electing someone who has his or her roots in the past authoritarian regime. On the other hand, there's an argument to be made and the journal published an article that made it, that having what are known as authoritarian successor parties involved in the post-transition political spectrum can be an advantage for democracy, because it brings into the democratic arena people who otherwise might be determined to bring down the democracy itself. So probably varies in each situation. It's certainly not something one's inclined to welcome, but it may not always have only negative consequences. And
I'll say a word to Alex's question. It's a big question because there's a big challenge, and I think the book probably doesn't cover all of the challenges, but even what's there is enough to kind of make the hair on your neck stand up. But I think things that are within our reach at some level, certainly taking the integrity and the work of rules-based institutions more seriously. So it's clear from our discussions that the Chinese and the Russians, they take this very seriously. And they really put their people in place with very clear ideas of what they want to get out of their engagement, whether it's on discussions of internet governance or the way in which election monitoring should be done by the OSCE's ODIHR and so forth. They've really refocused themselves over this period towards their aims, which are largely to neuter or otherwise hobble what I would call the kind of meaningful and legitimate work of these entities. So this is something that, with, I think, political focus and will, there could be headway made. It wouldn't be easy, it would take some time, but that's one area. The other is thinking hard about how to more meaningfully safeguard the work of civil society. It's terribly difficult for all the reasons that have been stated here, because these regimes are, as Will describes in his book and as he described today, they're really focused in a laser-like way on how to just cleanse the landscape of alternative elites and voices that can challenge them, in essence. But in the absence of that, not only do these societies and systems pay a heavy price, but so do their partners outside the country. So this is something that should get more attention, kind of a modern look at how you can defend civil society. And then finally, I think what's one of the most striking dimensions of the book, and this is, I think this will resonate with all the people on the panel here, it's just how profoundly the information space has changed in the last quarter century. So if we were sitting here 20 years ago thinking about the direction of the news media, or I think that the consensus would be, well, you know, it's not perfect, but it looks kind of good. This internet thing is taking off, and people should have access to information in ways that, and we know now that it hasn't turned out that way. The forces that already had momentum in the 90s, before the 90s, for the newspaper industry, for authentic news about civic affairs, that was already under enormous pressure then. That only gained momentum, and certainly after the financial crisis, it's hit established democracies, young democracies. And I think in the meantime, and this is a kind of a subplot of the book, the authoritarians invest enormous amounts of thought and money into this sector, essentially exploiting the space. So they do this at the domestic level, But now, just to use Central Europe, it's only one example, they put a lot of attention and resources into this space. China has an enormous interest in sub-Saharan Africa with its media and makes its content available at very low rates or free rates there as well. So I think here, I would say this is as much a question of political will and interest at some level. Of course, economics and commercial factors are enormous in this consideration. But I think over this decade period in particular, things have really shifted where the space has been drained in many ways of quality news content, relatively speaking. There's still quite a bit of good content out there generated by people on this panel among them. But I think if you look in the aggregate, the challenge has really become severe, and this requires some new thinking. This requires a real focus.
And I think that's exactly right. And on the agenda question, I think, we shouldn't underestimate how most people still don't understand what's in this book. And when I said, President Obama had the right policy maybe for 2005, so much of his emphasis has been on we have to get the United States right so that we can set the good example and, fix Guantanamo and so forth, which is great. But what we've seen in the last 10 years is they don't want to follow that example. And that's important, but not sufficient. And so not only do I think a lot of people still think, oh, generally things are going in the right direction and the internet is a force for freedom and so forth. They certainly have not accepted the idea, which is also in this book, that the surge in authoritarianism is a threat to us or a danger to us. Again, in the Cold War, I think most people believed that communism, if it spread, was a danger to what we now call the homeland. That is not, at the moment, a widely accepted, that's a premise that has to be explained and internalized, and we're not there yet. And, I think if you did have an administration and a Congress that understood that, then there are a lot of, creative things they could start to get your agency thinking about this in new ways, particularly about how do you sanction the people you want to sanction, but still engage with the people you want to engage with, right? I mean, that's obviously a big, big question that we're not that great at. I think we could get a lot better at. But first, somebody would have to say, that's the mission, that's the goal. And then I think people would come up with good ideas to do it.
Yeah, I would add, and maybe trying to combine a couple of these together, I think that, at the root of the question sort of about authoritarian succession, another way of thinking about it is, and actually a lot of these ideas and research has been, detailed and explained in the Journal of Democracy. We have a lot of ideas about how to raise the probability of success, how at critical moments when a country is moving from a moment of authoritarianism to a more pluralistic system, things that there are no guarantees, and each situation has its unique qualities, but there are, over time, a number of different factors that can be helpful. And I think it's important that we not overstate the United States' ability to certainly in any way engineer these outcomes, but there's value in a political system opting for a parliamentary system over a presidential system. And it's not shocking that coming out of an authoritarian system, it's so common to opt for a more presidential style system, even if that isn't the best statistical option. Or, going to Mark's point, exclusion of former political actors in that new political system can be very harmful as they play the role of a spoiler. I mean, it's really important to remember that one of the advantages for those who are trying to combat these trends is that the people that were probably part of that ruling party were not there for ideological reasons. It was bereft of ideology. They were maybe opportunists, but one thing they are people that understand how the system works and can be valuable in trying to bring about that change, whatever their beliefs may be. So I think that sort of it's an awareness of some of these trends, and thank goodness there's a journal that will explain it to you on a regular basis.
Thank you. Let me just add one word on the religion question so Kathy doesn't feel wholly ignored. Clearly, I'd say of our exemplars of authoritarianism, some of them religion is a key factor. In Iran, clearly, in Saudi Arabia, possibly in Russia, although it's more ambiguous. But China is still officially an atheistic state, and I would, other than Chavez worship, it's hard to know what role religion might have played in Venezuela. So I would say it can be important, but it's not, not true in all cases, certainly. Additional questions? Let's take a few more. Martha Bayless, then here, and then Art.
Hi, I'm Martha Bayless, as you said. It's a little late in the day, but I'm going to introduce what I would regard as the elephant in the information space. Okay. If you look back at what projected American society, democracy, and freedom onto the world after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, you would see overwhelmingly our entertainment media. And you would see overwhelmingly the fact that most people in the world do not seek out news on the new media of satellite television, followed by the internet. They seek out entertainment. And primarily, for many of those years, it was American entertainment. And a lot of it was, shall we say, the lower end of our entertainment. And usually the reaction to this is a smile and a shrug. But I think that's an underreaction. I think it's a very serious issue, actually, because I think that influenced the way people saw our society. And they saw the moral character of our society. They saw the way we use and abuse freedom. And they saw also the nature of our institutions, the way they're depicted by Hollywood. And, I love Hollywood as much as anybody else. But you all know it's a kind of exaggerated, it exaggerates the malaise and the problems of our societies for reasons to frighten us and amuse us and anger us. But overseas, it's often taken as an accurate depiction. And I think this is still the case, and I think it has played a role in the increasing gap between the westernized elites in various countries, including your five, who understand the importance of liberal democracy and its norms, rule of law, and the rest of the population whose main source of information about our society has been through entertainment. And when you mentioned, Chris, at the beginning of your talk, that this new information space has been, you say it's more attractive than the old propaganda. Of course it is. And one of the things that makes it attractive is state-produced entertainment, state-produced all kinds of things, sometimes copying us, but presenting a whole new vision of society, which is pitted and oftentimes, with more or less skill, against the vision that our society has projected. And I'm just curious to know if I haven't read the book, if there's any room in the book for that, how you regard that issue. And also, just to be completely depressing, I'll point out that there's practically nothing that we can do about it, short of some kind of censorship or restriction of trade that, of course, Americans would find anathema. But the elephant is in the room, so I thought I would point it out.
Thank you. Why don't we go to Art first, since he's back there, and then we'll take this gentleman afterwards.
Art Kaufman, visiting fellow here at the National Endowment. Happy to say. Along the lines, I think, of a few comments or questions that have just been raised, and there's really more for Fred Hyatt, but I welcome others from the panel. And that is really about what you see right now as being the disposition of the American people with respect to advancing democracy. We're down to 4 candidates right now in our current election. One of them is going to give an inaugural address in January. what would you write into an inaugural address in January that you think would help build some sort of popular consensus or agreement in this country about the objectives of advancing democracy internationally? I mean, I think, I haven't read the book yet either, but I would certainly guess that the point that comes across is that we're at an extremely critical point, not in American history, but in human history. So we have to rise to the occasion. And the worse the situation gets, it seems to me, the higher the level of response. And setting aside war, which nobody wants to hear about in an inaugural address, and on the one side, on the other side, at the risk of raising expectations around the world about what the U.S. is bound to do, how would you educate the American people and bring them to an understanding that would allow some sort of leadership on this issue in the next presidency?
Thank you. And then down here, Ian. This will be our last round, so if anyone else has a burning desire to say something, indicate it.
Thank you very much. My name is Sabghatullah. Currently, I'm at Georgetown University. I'm from Afghanistan. My question is on the way forward. Yes, there are these regimes getting more and more authoritarian. How should the democratic community go ahead? Shall the push be on soft issues like internet freedom and access to media and things like that? Or shall we raise hard questions, difficult questions like issue of Tibet with China, Eastern Turkestan with China, Muslim minority of Uyghurs and things like that? So which one would be a good option?
Okay. All right, thank you. All right, just one last comment.
Yes. Yeah, my name is Josephat Moore, and I'm a blogger, and I also write about conservation issues. My question is, I like your conversation, but there are also issues too in the United States. In the last few years, personally, I face some challenges here, and part of it is because the court system plays a major role, and one of the issues we are seeing is that, especially immigrants, is that sometimes you file documents in court and then they change. Documents are changed, the stamps, and then stuff is done there. So when the courts don't operate the way they should, it becomes a threat to the country itself. So these are issues you might want to look at. And I don't want to get into details, but we are seeing a target. People are targeted in a certain way when they actually mean well to your society, because we are connected. What happens in Africa, what happens in Europe, and translates in the U.S. If we could help, I think we should welcome people who want to help the community, because we want to live all in peace and in the future. So what I'm saying is that there are issues of corruption also, which we need to find a way to address them also within the site here.
Thank you very much. All right, so this will be our last round. Maybe we should do it in reverse order of the way you spoke originally. Let's go to Fred first.
Okay. Well, I'll take two of them. The last gentleman's question, I certainly agree. An important part of our soft power in fighting authoritarianism is continuing to show that the United States is a welcoming society. This campaign has not put that forward in the best light. There are specific questions for immigrants in court, in immigration court, where at the moment there is no right to an attorney. And I think there's a very legitimate question to be raised of whether that's fair, particularly for children who are being deported. And then you want me to write the inaugural address. Uh, I would just say, when you say, you know, how would I educate the American people, I would turn that around. I would ask, how can we let the American people educate the people who are running for president? Because I think the field of candidates that we've ended up with do not reflect what remains the true spirit of the American people, which is generally open to the world. Of course, concerned about globalization and its negative economic effects, but generally still predisposed to the idea of American leadership. Having said that, I think it has always taken leadership to persuade Americans that it's worth making this sacrifice, and very naturally so. You know, why would anybody want to see their kid go off to Afghanistan and face danger half the way around the world? The natural thing is to say, you know, what I remember John Kerry saying in 2004, why are we building, when he was running, why are we building fire stations in Baghdad? We could be building them in North Carolina. You know, it takes the president to say, yes, we need to do nation building at home, but there's a reason that we need to care about the world. And I think it remains true that if you have leadership that will make the case, you have a population that will respond to it.
Thank you. Well,
I'll perhaps try to take on the question of low culture. I think it was, and I don't know if I understood every aspect of the question as phrased. I mean, I guess I would push back a little bit on that and just say I'm not sure how much the dreck really hurts our image. You know, that's not obvious to me. I mean, I think that people have been capable of maintaining Baywatch and democracy in their minds at the same time, and you know, it's not maybe the best advertisement for our cultural values, but the applications to American universities and the lines at U.S. embassies for visas and travel, I think, is maybe the best indicator of the allure that this sometimes disappointing culture still has. You know, so I'm not sure. I think it's an interesting question, but I think you hit the nail on the head by noting that there's probably nothing we could do about it anyway, even if we wanted to. I guess we'll look for the next Downton Abbey and move on.
So Martha,
last word to Chris.
So Martha, just briefly, you've raised the question, but of course, you've quite literally written the book on this. So I think you know the answer to the question you've asked. I think at some level, it's not only our culture, but as generated by Hollywood, but it's our political elites, it's the nature of the discussion at the elite opinion level, has to be refocused in the ways that, or at least oriented through education and through some prioritization in the ways that both Fred and Will have described on some level. If you think about now, you know, Hollywood, as you've written, has kind of become more craven over the years, less moored, at least in the way you wrote about it, to any sort of connection to the higher part of American culture. How you measure the impact overseas, that may be, you know, a question, but I think the fact that China is now, just to kind of tie the knot on this, has decided to invest in Hollywood in very serious ways, and Hollywood is willing, at least so far, to curb their standards of expression in order to access the Chinese market. This raises a whole host of questions about how we are defending our values in an age of integration and globalization. And I think, you know, the authoritarians, they have a view and they have a preference on this. I think that's what I would emphasize. I think the questions, you know, there may not be an evident and easy answer, but at some level, when you start to think through what your own preferences are and what ours are collectively, that may help provide the response to those who have preferences that are at odds with our values and standards.
Thank you. Again, I think a central point that we hope the book gets across is that this problem is out there, it's growing, it's a genuine threat to democracy, if not tomorrow or next week, certainly in the relatively not too distant future. And very few people have been paying sufficient attention to it. So we hope its publication will bring more focus on this very serious question. With that, let me thank our three excellent speakers and thank all of you for coming.